Hi, this is Aaron Lacey. Good afternoon to the folks on the East Coast, and good morning still to the folks out west. You are tuning in to Navigating Gainful Employment. This is our Gainful Employment webinar series that we're doing here at Thompson Coburn. For those who don't know me, my name is Aaron Lacey, and I'm a partner here in the higher education practice at Thompson Coburn. Thompson Coburn is a law firm. We have about 400 attorneys, and we're based in St. Louis, Missouri, but we have offices in other places like D.C. and L.A. and Chicago. Our higher education practice, I always tend to divide what we do into three sort of buckets. The first is we provide regulatory counsel on federal, state, and accrediting agencies, laws and standards that affect post-secondary education, so like gainful employment, the federal financial aid programs, Title IV, Title IX, CLARI, et cetera. In the second bucket, we also assist institutions with all different kinds of policy creation, transactions, drafting contracts. That can include everything up to mergers and acquisitions, and that's including for-profits and nonprofits alike. It is possible, as you may know, sometimes nonprofits go through mergers or changes of that nature. Finally, we also represent schools in student and employee litigation. We have a whole group of litigators that do schoolwork, government investigations, so that would be, the Department of Education, EEOC, those kinds of things, administrative proceedings, and audits and reviews, so Department of Ed program reviews, things like that. Just so you know a little bit more about me, before I was at Thompson Coburn, I spent 4 years in-house at a post-secondary institution where I oversaw regulatory compliance, government affairs matters for about 24, 25 campuses in the Midwest and Southeast. So did that for 4 years. So I've been on the other side of the telephone call with counsel. I've been responsible for implementing and dealing with regulations like gainful employment. In fact, I was in-house when the 2011 gainful employment rules came out, and spent several years implementing that at our campus and sort of contending with those regulations. So very much appreciate what that's like. And then before that, I spent about 8 years in another law firm in Washington, D.C. in their higher education practice. One of the recommendations someone gave was, why don't we at the outset talk about or just briefly note the presentations in the series, because I tend to make references to those throughout the presentation. So here they are. There are 5 of them. We did projecting debt-to-earnings rates last week. This week, in red, we're doing strategies for improving debt-to-earnings rates. And then you can see in the coming weeks, we'll talk about completer lists, challenges, debt challenges, et cetera. We'll talk about managing required student warnings, and also managing and challenging the GE disclosures. There's a whole different process for challenges that pertains to the disclosures as opposed to the debt-to-earning rates. Here's the outline. So in every one of these presentations, I'm going to take a few minutes to go through the GE timeline. I think that's really important, and I'm hopeful that folks will internalize that. I don't want anyone to be caught off guard with regard to what's coming their way. I'll do a very brief DE rate refresher, and that's just a few slides, but it's important, again, to remember what are the components of these rates, because a lot of the strategies rely on you understanding how the rates are constructed. But the heart of the presentation, majority of the slides, will all relate to different types of rate strategies you can employ as an institution to potentially impact your DE rates. And then finally, we'll again just go through 2 or 3 slides that give you links to GE resources. Speaking of links, when you get the version of this presentation, when we circulate the slides, there are active links throughout these presentations, and hopefully you'll be able to just click on those and get right to the resource. So the gainful employment timeline. This is last year, so you know the regs became effective July 1. You reported a lot of data, first on July 31st of last year and then October 1st. In November, you for the first time would have had the opportunity to register to receive completers lists through the SEIG enrollment website, and also to enroll in the data challenge and appeals solution service. Now, these are both things you may recall. I spoke about this last week. Next week, we're actually going to talk in depth about completers lists and the various kinds of challenges. But here's what you need to know today, and that is this year, one of the things you're going to be able to do, and I'll talk about on the very next slide, is to challenge the department's list of the folks that they think should be part of your DE rate. So they're going to send back, for each one of your programs, they're going to send back a list, and they're going to say, these are the students we think that we should be including in the cohort and for whom we're going to look at debt and earnings information. That's a completers list, right? And there's a process through which you're going to have the opportunity to challenge that list and say, we think certain people maybe should be included or excluded. The way that they're going to do that, they're going to distribute these lists through the SAIG enrollment website, right? And then if you want to challenge, you're going to have the opportunity to challenge through this DACS system. These are both new concepts. The salient point here is they're both up right now, and you can already go in and register to receive the completers list when it comes out, and also go ahead and register to be part of the DACS system. I highly encourage you to do that. There's no reason not to, and if and when the completers lists are finally distributed, you want to make sure that you get it. You don't want to miss that. So I would go ahead and do both of these things if you haven't. Finally, December 31st of last year was the deadline to complete the GE transitional certification. That's an addenda to your program participation agreement. If you did not do that, I just suggest that you go ahead and do it now, right? There are some people who didn't get to doing it, and that basically the solution so far has been just to get it done. So if you think you didn't do that, get it done now. You can find more information about how to do that if you go to the department's Gainful Employment website, which is part of the IFAP website. There are 2 or 3 electronic announcements that came out last year that speak specifically to the GE transitional certification. There's also a link to that IFAP website in the resources section of this presentation later. Okay, so this year, these are the big items coming up. The first is this spring, the issuance of the 14-15 completers list. That's what I was just talking about. Now, originally they were supposed to put out the completers list in December, and then just a couple of weeks ago, an electronic announcement came out and it said we're going to have to delay the issuance of the completers list. You all will be pleased to know I had a nice conversation with a colleague of yours in the industry last week who was kind enough to give me a call and get me up to speed, and some of you may already know this. But the department actually beta tested the completers list distribution. So they picked a handful of institutions in different sectors with different ownership structures, so public, private, nonprofit. And they said, look, we want to try to push these completer lists out to you, and we want to see how it works. So they did that in late December, or maybe I guess it was November, December of last year, and there were a lot of problems, and there were a lot of suggestions that these institutions came back with. So the reason this was delayed in part is because the department actually understood that there were major issues with the way it was working and that they had more work to do before they went live with the completers list distribution. So that is really, in my view, a positive thing. Better that they took a handful of schools and beta tested before sending it out to everyone and discovering that they had a number of significant issues. And that's why the delay, is because the department's working to try to take those suggestions and figure out how to make the whole completers list process more sensible. So right now they're still saying spring, and my guess is it's going to be more like April probably, or even May, based on my conversation that I had earlier this week with that individual. This summer, they are still saying that they expect to issue the draft DE rates. As soon as those are issued, then you're going to have a couple more opportunities to challenge data. One will be the loan debt challenges, and then in addition later in the fall, you'll have the opportunity to put in an alternative earnings appeal, or really right after the draft DE rates come out, you'll have that opportunity begins. All of this timing is subject to revision. Obviously, the department is working through all of these things. But the thing I really want folks on the other end of the line here to understand is you've got a lot coming your way, and the big theme for this year is you're going to be getting data from the department, and you're going to have opportunities to challenge that data. So you want to make sure that you've done what you need to do to receive the data, like registering, on the SAIG enrollment website, and you want to be prepared and think about whether you're going to try to challenge some of that information. And this is a mechanism among all the strategies we're going to discuss today. I mean, really, this is another possibility for trying to improve your rates is through scrubbing and challenging the data. Okay, and then 2017. I really want folks, don't think about this right now, but sort of put this on the back burner to think about late this year, because in very early 17, if the department sticks with its timeline, that's when you're going to see the issuance of the final DE rates. They said January, maybe it's February, but it's still probably the first part of the year if they can do it. And you're also going to have the new GE disclosures become effective in January 17, and that's under the law, so there's no question about that. And then you'll continue to have this opportunity in that period likely to work on alternative earnings appeals. So you've got a lot going on in January. You know, this year you're focused on those challenges, but you just want to make sure that you're not caught off guard when all of this stuff starts to hit next January. So maybe this fall start thinking about some of these things as well. In addition, after the final DE rates come out, if you have a program that fails year one, you will be required to do these student warnings. You'll recall that's the fourth webinar in this series. I'm going to talk about the student warnings, but that could have significant impact on enrollment. So that's another thing you want to be thinking about this fall. If you've got a program you're pretty sure it's going to fail in year one, you probably want to give some consideration to how you might manage those student warning disclosures in a way that gets the disclosure across, but hopefully mitigates too much damage to your enrollment process. Okay, so now let's take a deep breath and let's just remind ourselves a little bit about the DE rates and how they're constructed. So there are two. So that means for every gainful employment program that you offer, the Department of Education is going to calculate two rates. First is the annual earnings rate. The second is the discretionary income rate. Both of these rates use annual loan payment in the numerator. And then the first one uses annual earnings in the denominator. Discretionary income is just a slight revision of that annual earnings number. It's similar. For most schools, and I think I mentioned this last week, the discretionary income rate really comes into play and is useful to you if you have an expensive program with graduates that make a lot of money. If you've got an inexpensive program with graduates that make a modest amount of money, you're probably going to be looking at your annual earnings rate, and that's going to be the key to passing, not the discretionary income rate. So what is the annual loan payment? For each GE program, the department takes either a 2- or 4-year cohort of qualifying students. So they're going to say they're going to look at a 2-year period or 4-year period. And they're going to look at the folks who graduated during that period. And they're going to determine the lesser of the median loan debt or median costs assessed for that whole cohort. So they're going to say a bunch of people graduated either in this 2- or 4-year window. We want to look at how much you charged them in the way of costs and how much debt they took on and what was the median for that cohort. And then they're going to amortize that median debt number and come up with an annual loan payment. And that's your numerator, okay? I know that's a lot to absorb, and in a minute I'm going to talk about a resource that I talked about last week that you can use to sort of break all this down. The denominator for the annual earnings rate is the annual earnings for the cohort. This is the information the department gets from the Social Security Administration. So they will send that completers list that I referred to earlier off to Social Security. Social Security will look up the earnings for those folks, and then Social Security will send back to the department both the mean and the median for the cohort, and they will use the higher of the two. So in that case, the institutions get the benefit of the higher number. Discretionary income is basically annual earnings. The only difference is you subtract from annual earnings 150% of the poverty guideline for a single person in the U.S. is published by HHS. So that's a number that HHS comes up with. In the last couple of years, it's been between $11,000 and $12,000. So basically, they'll just take your annual earnings number, the denominator from your annual earnings rate, and they'll just subtract from that. It's about 11,000 times 1.5. Okay, so I know that's a lot to absorb. In a minute, I'll refer to the desk guide, but we have a resource for you that you can use to sort of break down the rates and understand those components a little better. You will recall from last week, again, that these are the things you have to try to accomplish with these rates. So the idea is for each GE program, ultimately you want them to pass. You want the rates to be passing. They are passing, or your program will pass if your annual earnings rate is less than or equal to 8%, or your discretionary income rate is less than or equal to 20%. So if you can hit on either one of these, you know, if you are a school that benefits from the discretionary income rate, if either your AER or your DIR meets this threshold, then the program passes. Okay. Now, let's say you don't pass if your AER is greater than 8% and less than or equal to 12%. So you're in that range of 8 to 12%, and your discretionary income rate is not passing, right? You would be in the zone. Alternatively, if your discretionary income rate is greater than 20 and less than or equal to 30, so between 20 and 30, and your AER is not passing, you would be in the zone. So the italicized text was actually added this week. That was another great comment from someone who listened in last week, because they're right, and I wanted to make clear, if either one of these pass, you pass, right? So you're only in the zone if you've got a rate that's in that middle area and the other rate's not a passing, right? Finally, to fail, you have to fail on both. So your annual earnings rate has to be greater than 12%, and your discretionary income rate has got to be greater than 30%. Or I'm sorry, AER should be greater than 12%, and DIR has to be greater than 30%. So that's an and. You've got to fail on both counts for the program to actually fail for that year. In terms of sanctions, a GE program becomes ineligible if the program fails 2 out of any 3 consecutive award years for which rates are calculated, or has a combination of zone and failing rates for 4 consecutive award years for which rates are calculated. And we discussed last week, that if in certain circumstances, if your cohort is too small, then they won't calculate a rate for you. You'll just get a no result for that year. Finally, the student warnings, that's the other type of sanction that's in play here. So one is ineligibility if you meet one of those criteria above in the top part of the slide. But you have to issue those student warnings at any point at which your program is within a year of losing eligibility. So, for example, if you fail in year 1, if your program fails in year 1, I should say, then you'll have to immediately start issuing student warnings, because in theory, you are within a year of losing eligibility if you were to fail 2 years in a row. Similarly, if you were in the zone 3 years in a row, you would have to start issuing the student warnings, because again, you would conceivably be within a year of losing eligibility. Now look, if you're in zone in year 1, the program's in the zone in year 1, you don't have to issue the student warning, because there's no way you could lose your eligibility the following year, even if you failed, because going zone and fail don't leave you ineligible, right? It's only if your program is a year out from potentially losing eligibility, that's the point at which you would have to issue a student warning. All right. So now let's talk about strategies, and that's really the heart of today's session. The first thing to keep in mind is there's no silver bullet. I mean, there's no single strategy or approach that's going to work for every institution. Schools typically, in our experience, are going to benefit from a combination of strategies. So what that means is you need to, 1, understand your institution and the data. So you really need to know or have a sense as to where you're likely going to come out for each of your programs. Understand the available strategies, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And then you have to select and implement the ones that are most likely to be effective for you. In terms of understanding your data, and this is the resource I was talking about, folks who were on last week know about this. So we put out a desk guide last year, and we've kept it up to date. It's, I don't know, 11, 12 pages, and it has a 9-step process for helping you project rates. So you can sit down with this thing and walk through it page by page, and it should really assist you in understanding how the rates are constructed by the department and how you can go about trying to project what rates likely are going to be for each of your programs. We circulated that last week when we sent out the slides. We will do that again this week and with the slides for every presentation. So we're just going to keep disseminating the desk guide. If for some reason you did not get a copy or you didn't get the email, just give us a holler. We're happy to send you a copy. Program portfolio strategies, and we've sort of grouped the strategies based on what they target here. In this case, these strategies all revolve around doing something to the program portfolio you're currently offering. And again, some will work for some schools and some won't. The first is reevaluate SIP codes assigned to your GE programs. Okay, so as you know, when you roll out and get a new program approved and you put it on your eligibility certification and approval report, your ECAR, which the department generates, each GE program has a SIP code, or classification of instructional programs code, attached to it, right? This is a 6-digit number, 2 digits, a period, and 4 more. Okay, over time, SIP codes are retired and reorganized. The SIP system is maintained by the feds, and literally every decade or so, they will go in and they'll decide that maybe things need to be moved around or recoded, or certain numbers will be retired. And the fact is that institutions rarely revisit SIP codes following their initial assignment. So you may have a program that got approved 35 years ago and you attached a SIP code to it. I don't know, 35 might be too aggressive, but let's say 15 or 20 years ago, you attached a SIP code to it, and somewhere in the interim, the SIP codes were adjusted or things were moved around, and that SIP code may not even exist anymore, or it may no longer be the best option for your program. If a program is approved on the e-car, it constitutes a new GE program from the department's perspective, right? Because we talked about last week, the way the department defines a GE program within a single OPID is simply by credential level and SIP. So the benefit here is if you look at a program that currently exists and you determine that you need an entirely different 6-digit SIP code that goes with that program, if you update the SIP code attached to that program, it essentially becomes a new GE program. And in that way, you jettison the history that was attached to that program, right? Now, we certainly are not advocating that folks go out and manipulate SIP codes just to try to better their E-score or their rates. I have no doubt the department will be on the lookout for that. But the fact is there are many institutions that when they go through this exercise, they find appropriately that it's time to update a SIP code, and there could be a benefit to you if you do that in terms of your DE rates. Okay. Create new, shorter versions of GE programs. This is a no-brainer, right? If you have a program right now that's offered over 2 years and you can offer it, and it's a GE program, and you can offer it over 1 year, then that means students are going to likely qualify for less money in the way of loans, and you can probably offer the program for less. So if the key, determine whether graduates can secure employment and a strong salary with the shorter program. And if they can, if you decide that your associate degree could probably offer it as a diploma in 18 months, something like that, then you may actually be able to reduce the cost and debt elements associated with that program, right? And so in that way, improve your DE rates. Now, I understand there are some programs out there, cosmetology, massage therapy, where they aren't able to do this. I've had a lot of conversations with folks in the cosmetology world over the last few weeks. Some of you I know are on the line right now. And I believe that this is definitely an area where you might want to consider lobbying your state, right? Because there's variety across the different states as to how long these prescribed cosmetology programs are. There are some outliers where it's 2,100. There are some others on the other end where it's 1,000 hours. I know most are at 1,500. But the fact is, it might be worth your time to lobby the state hard to give you a shorter option, even if they want to make it an alternative in a slightly different program, so that you have the ability potentially to offer a program at a lower price point and for which students can get fewer loans. Quick note, do not voluntarily discontinue any older program. If you're going to roll out a new shorter program, do not discontinue the older program until the replacement program is approved by the department. Under the law, the new GE regs, if you voluntarily discontinue a program, voluntarily, so you're not required at this point, but if you voluntarily discontinue a program for which the department's already informed you that the draft DE rates were failing or in the zone. So let's say you got a letter after year one and they said, hey, for this program your rates are failing or in the zone. If you said, well, let's discontinue it. At that point, you would trigger a 3-year moratorium on rolling out a substantially similar program, right? So let me say that again. If you don't voluntarily discontinue the program, nothing is triggered. So year one rolls around, it turns out you failed or we're in the zone, you keep that program going while you work on getting the new program approved, no problem, right? But if you were to voluntarily discontinue the old program, then under the law you could not get a new substantially similar program approved and on your e-car for 3 years. And a program is substantially similar if the two programs share the same 4-digit zip code, the four digits of the zip code are the same. That means if you're rolling out a shorter version of your current program, it probably is going to share the same 4-digit root on its zip code, right? So if you voluntarily discontinue that failing program before you get the new one out, you may have just created a wall and kept yourself from being able to get the new program approved. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you get the old one approved and on the e-car before you get the new one off. Okay. Create degree versions of challenge GE programs. Now, this is for the nonprofit folks only, right? But because under the law, associate degree programs and up, degree programs that are offered by nonprofit institutions are not gainful employment programs, you could actually go in the other direction. Instead of shortening your program, if you've got an 18-month diploma or certificate program and you think it would be appropriate and you've got good, solid content and you could turn that into an associate degree program, you essentially could lengthen the program and pull it out from under the gainful employment regulations. So for you, that would probably be a strategy you would want to consider. Discontinue the program at locations with poor DE rates. Now, I mean, hopefully if you have the time and you can project your DE rates, right, this is a strategy you might want to consider. This only works for multi-campus institutions, and here's why it works. The Department of Education, and I discussed last week, when they calculate your debt-to-earning rates for a program, right, they're going to do that across the entire OPEID. So let's say you've got 7 locations. And at your location in New York, New Orleans, and Los Angeles, you offer a medical assisting associate degree, right? And it's got the same zip code at all 3. For the department, that's one program. It's all in the same OPID, even though it's different locations. And when they crunch your DE rates, they're going to take the data from all 3 of those locations. Now, let's say you project DE rates on a campus-by-campus basis, and you figure out that in LA and New Orleans, you're doing really well, right? Graduates are making better money because the markets there pay better, and maybe you even offer the program at a lower price point, right, because those markets aren't as expensive, theoretically, as New York. I'm just making this up for now. The point is, by discontinuing the program in New York, where maybe the students take on a lot of debt because it's expensive to live there, and for some reason they're not making much when they graduate, you may be able to improve the DE rate for that program overall, right, so that you are able to preserve the program in LA and New Orleans. So you get the point. So in this sense, there may be value for you to project your rates on a location-by-location basis, even though that's, like I say, when the department actually does it, they're going to do it for the program across the whole OPID. But if you're able to get a fix and determine that you've got 1 or 2 locations that are causing you particular heartburn, you might consider teaching the program out at those locations so that the other locations can continue to thrive. Increase graduate marketability and earnings with programmatic accreditation and certifications. I understand this is a tall order. This isn't a quick fix type thing, but you all know there are a lot of different programmatic accreditations and certifications out there that are not required for your graduates to become employed. Now, that's not always the case. I mean, I'm an attorney. You know, ABA programmatic accreditation is these days required to even sit for the bar exam in almost every state. You know, I mean, there are some loopholes in some states, but almost everywhere, look, you really need to have a credential from an ABA accredited law school. And in most cases, ABA accreditation is programmatic accreditation, right? But it's so necessary that it's tough to even offer a program that's not ABA accredited. There are a few out there, but it's tough. On the other hand, there are other types of certifications and programmatic accreditations, again, as you know, that really, they may not have a significant market value, and you may in the past have said, you know, we don't need to secure this. But by securing it, you may be able, it may increase the employability of your graduates, and it may mean that their starting salaries are more significant. So one thing you might want to do is reevaluate whether there are programmatic accreditations or industry certifications that are available to graduates of your GE program, and consider whether or not by integrating those into your program, right, you would be able to increase, again, your students' and graduates' marketability and earnings. Because if you can increase the likelihood that they will get strong employment and good earnings, well, obviously, as long as they're reporting their earnings accurately, that's going to benefit your DE rate analysis. Okay, reduce tuition and fees assessed for existing GE programs. So, I mean, this is a simple fix, and this is the one, the kind of fix that doesn't, unlike the one in the prior slide, it's, you know, it's immediate, and you can do it unilaterally. It doesn't involve you trying to also, you know, manage students and employers and all those kinds of things like the prior strategy. So, total cost assessed, when the department crunches the DE rates, and we talked about this last week, right? Total cost assessed is tuition and fees assessed the student plus the greater of the total amount of the allowances for book supplies and equipment included in the cost of attendance or the actual amount assessed by the institution. But at any rate, the point is the cost assessed is more or less in your control. It's the amount that you're charging the student on the ledger, right? And when the department goes to determine the debt load for each student, they're going to actually look at the lesser of the cost assessed or the median debt that the student took on, right? And if the cost assessed is a lower number, that's the one they'll go with. So if you typically have students that you charge $10,000, right, and most of them are only taking out more than that in loans, so $12,000 or $13,000, that means the department's going to be taking a $10,000 number on a regular basis when they're crunching your DE rates. If you cut costs, the tuition for the program, to $9,000 or $8,000, that's going to benefit your DE rate, right? But obviously you need to sort of think about where your margins are, whether that's viable for the institution over the long term, that kind of thing. The other thing that's really important to understand, and this is in the law, and this is something the department included in some guidance that came out, I think, in February. The cost assessed number is literally the amount you charge the student up front. It's not a net number. When you report that to the Department of Education each year, you're not reporting to them the $10,000 you charge the student minus a $2,000 institutional grant you gave them, or write down, or scholarship, or whatever you want to call it. So let me put it to you in practical terms. If you charge a student $10,000 and you say, hey, we're going to try to improve our gainful employment rates, we're going to give everybody a $2,000 scholarship, that's not going to work, at least not for this solution, right? Because the department is still going to take that $10,000 number, because that's what you assess the student up front, and they're not going to net out the scholarship or write down or grant, right? So it's just really important. I would hate for a school out there to give everyone a $2,000 scholarship for purposes of improving their DE rates and then discover that that doesn't work. What works is if you lower tuition to $8,000 so that the actual amount you assess the student up front on the ledger is only $8,000. So please keep that in mind. Okay, debt strategiges. So I mentioned for each student, they're going to look at which one is less. Is it the amount you charge the student, or is it the amount of debt that the student took on, right? So these strategies all are about trying to affect that debt number, not the cost assessed number. So one thing is to try to reduce loan debt by offering institutional grants or scholarship programs. So I just told you, you're not going to improve the cost assessed number through institutional grants or scholarship programs, right? That's not going to work, because the cost assessed is whatever you charged them at the beginning. That's the $10,000, right? But you could potentially improve the loan debt number by offering institutional grant or scholarship programs. So while institutional grants and scholarships won't reduce cost assessed, they may reduce student borrowing, right? Because if the program's $10,000 and you give them $2,000, maybe they'll borrow less because they won't need as much to cover costs and attendance. Now, that's a maybe. I know some students are going to max out those loans every time. But the point is, it's a possible strategy for you to consider. You should carefully evaluate whether you think those scholarships or grants are really going to have an impact. And that really is going to the point I just made, right? I mean, if you think if you give everybody a $1,000 scholarship, they're still going to borrow the exact same amount, then this isn't a strategy for you. But let's say you have a lot of students who already pay a little bit of cash and, you know, they aren't taking out the full amount of loans, and you think, you know, if I gave them $1,000 or $2,000 in the way of a scholarship, they would probably borrow less. This could be a strategy that would make sense. Ensure where possible that institutional credit is categorized as institutional debt and not private education loans. Now this one's complicated, but it's important. Okay, so you guys remember when the Higher Education Opportunity Act back in 2008 was enacted, right, and reauthorized the HEA. There was a whole bunch of stuff about preferred lender lists and private education loans and all those kinds of things. And at that point in time, right, there was a new definition of private education loan that came into being. And that concept of private education loan generally includes any extension of credit issued by a school to a student to finance educational expenses, so to finance their program. But there's a carve-out. The law excludes an extension of credit by a school if either the term is 90 days or less, or there is no interest rate and the term is 1 year or less. Okay, so why does this make a difference? When calculating debt totals for students for purposes of the DE rates, the department includes the total amount of any private education loan, regardless of whether a student made in-school payments. So if the instrument you're using, the financing option you're using and giving to that student is a private education loan under the law, then you're going to report the full amount of the principal to the department. It doesn't matter if the student made some payments on it before they graduated. When the department calculates the debt, they're going to include the full amount of the principal. However, the department only includes the amount outstanding as of program completion for all other institutional debt. Okay, so let me give you a practical example. Let's say you have a student, and I'll just make up numbers here. You know, the program's $10,000. They take out $8,000 in Title IV loans, so there's a $2,000 gap, right? So you decide to finance them, and I'm going to go back to the prior slide so you can see that definition of private education loan again. So look in the last one, okay? Remember, it's generally going to be a private education loan. So let's say it has, you do what you think of as a payment plan, okay? And there's no interest rate, right? But it's for a period of 2 years. We'll say this is a 2-year associate degree program, right? So it's a period of 2 years. This is a private education loan under the law, right? Because it's an extension of credit made by the school to the student to finance that $2,000 gap, okay? And again, even if you have no interest rate, if the term is over a year, it's a private education loan, which means when you report it to the department and they're calculating the debt number for you and figuring out your DE rate for this program, they're going to take the full $2,000. Now, let's say instead you did a payment plan, right? No interest rate, but for a period of less than a year, okay? For a period of less than a year. Now it's an extension of credit. And let's say over that period, the student paid off $500, right? Just theoretically, they paid off $500. Okay, now, instead of being a private education loan and the $2,000 getting rolled into the debt number, it's going to fall into that outstanding debt at the time of program completion. So when the student completes the program, you have to tell the department how much they still owed. Well, they only owed $500 on that payment plan, right? Because they paid off $500 while they were in school. I have had clients who, when they understood this distinction, they were offering payment plans to their students, no interest payment plans, and they discovered that they were all, say, 13 months or 14 months, just over the threshold, and they were having to report to the department the full amount of that principal, and it was getting rolled into the debt number for all of their GE analysis. And by simply changing the period of the financing instrument to less than a year, they were able to make it all institutional debt instead of a private education loan, and now they can benefit from any payments that the student makes while they are in school, right? So that's why the distinction between a private education loan and, quote, institutional debt is so important, because your payment plan could go either way depending on how it's constructed, and if it falls into that private education loan bucket, it probably will cost you more when it comes to calculating your DE rates. So this is another strategy if you're doing financing, gap financing for students, that could potentially really benefit you. Okay, reduce loan debt by offering private education loan option to parents. All right, so let's say you do make a private education loan. You know, you have a payment plan, but it doesn't work that the period would be for a year or less. It's definitely going to be for a 2-year period, so there's no way you're going to get it out of that private education loan category. But here's the deal. If the parent takes out the loan, the private education loan, if they actually sign on the dotted line, and I don't mean co-sign, I mean they sign on the dotted line, so that it's not debt for the student, then it doesn't go into your GE calculation, right? Because institutions are required to include low debt, which includes any private education loans that are made by the institution that the student borrowed for enrollment in the program. So if parents, and only parents, sign for the private education loan, the amounts would be excluded from that debt total, right? Because what happens is you make the loan to the parent, the money is credited to the student's account, right, to pay for the charges that they owe you, and then that outstanding debt is the parent's debt, not the student's debt, and doesn't get reported to the department as part of the debt number for that student. Reduce loan debt similarly by encouraging the use of Parent Plus loans. So philosophically, for the exact same reason, the department has excluded Parent Plus loans from the debt total that goes into the calculation for DE rates. So if you encourage borrowing by parents, if you actually have a student population where, you know, maybe there are parents out there who would be interested in taking on the loan debt, right, then that's going to improve your DE rates potentially, or in the least it's going to pull however much it is that they take out instead of their student taking it out. That's going to come off the DE calculation. Reduce institutional debt total by removing third-party or optional charges from the student ledger. Okay, so, and I talked a little bit about this a minute ago. Institutional debt, when they're calculating these rates, right, there are 3 components to the debt number. 1 is Title IV debt, 2 is private education loan debt, and the final is institutional debt. And institutional debt includes the amount outstanding. So it's just what's sitting on that ledger as of the date the student completes the program, right? and that's for any credit, including any unpaid charges extended by or on behalf of the institution. So this would even include like library fees, anything like that, right? In the department, there hadn't been a lot of guidance yet because I've had some schools say, well, what about parking fees? What about things that seem unrelated but are sitting on the ledger? Yeah, fair enough, and the department hasn't offered a lot of guidance on that point yet. But what we do know is, conceptually, the way it's supposed to work is you're supposed to look at that ledger at the time they complete the program, and if there are any outstanding charges, that's the number you report to the department, right, if those charges are related to the student's enrollment at the institution in that program. Okay. So one of the strategies you can use, right, is to try to get items off the ledger that don't have to be there. Historically, a lot of schools have permitted costs for third-party products and services, including optional ones, to be charged to the student account. And the idea here is, well, if it runs through the student account, maybe the student will be able to use FA potentially or other resources to handle that debt. But the problem is, once it sits on the ledger, there's the potential, if the student doesn't pay it off, that it gets rolled into this institutional debt number and becomes part of the DE rate calculation. So even though these services are often offered as a convenience, it potentially drives up the debt number. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I know a lot of medical assisting allied health programs, there may be immunizations or things like that are required, and you'll have a third party come on campus, and that third party will do the inoculations, and then the cost for that ends up on the student ledger, and the student can pay it that way, right? Well, that potentially is just going to end up in your institutional debt number. I was working with a school once upon a time that actually they had a diesel mechanic program, and they had worked out an arrangement with a tool provider that provided a very, very nice sort of tool package to students that they could optionally, it was not required, in their last term, if they wanted to, they could buy this tool package because apparently these were the kinds of tools that were pretty typically needed for folks who were then going out into employment, right? But the thing was, the tool package was something like $1,800. I mean, it was not inexpensive. And what happened was they were running it through the ledger. Right? So all of that, if the student graduated and hadn't paid it off in its entirety under the new GE rules, would be rolled into the debt calculation. So what we're saying here is, you know what, just have the student, you can still work out the arrangement with the tool provider, and that's great, but just have the student pay the tool provider directly, right, at the cost of not being able to use financial aid. But it may, as one of many strategies here, it may improve your DE number, particularly if you've got pretty significant items showing up on the ledger that fall into this category. Reduce institutional debt by adjusting your payment plan terms to optimize the likelihood of in-school payment. This is a simple concept, but you know, if you've got a payment plan and it's designed in a way that the payments are too large, right, and you don't believe, and students, and you can tell this historically, aren't paying it off, you might want to just consider reworking that, because the bottom line is if they're not making payments on the payment plan, at least as far as gainful employment goes, it's not benefiting you. You know, rather than have them not pay $500, it would make more sense to work out a payment plan where maybe you finance just $100 for them, right, and then they can make payments on that and actually pay that out, and it comes off of your institutional debt number. Another idea for you, now you may say, Aaron, that's great, but we've got a $500 gap. It doesn't do us any good to do a payment plan for $100. Something else you might consider is bifurcating, right, and give them two options simultaneously. So you put $100 on a payment plan that's less than a year, okay, so that you make sure you get the benefit of any payments they make on it. And then that other $400 you finance over, still no interest, right, but over 2 years, so it's a private ed loan, okay, but it's over 2 years now, and it's sort of separate and aside, right? So now you at least get the benefit of them paying off. If they make payments on that $100 payment plan, that nets out of the institutional debt number, right? And maybe it's $250, or, you know, you have to think about that. But the point is, if folks aren't making any payments, then you're not going to benefit at all, right? Just remember now, anything you categorize into a private ed loan, if you do some sort of bifurcation and have two things going on at the same time, anything that goes into the private ed loan, right, is you're not going to get any benefits even if they make payments on that. So, you know, you sort of want to think about your strategy here. Reduce institutional debt by writing off debt prior to program completion. This is a pretty radical strategy, but when you start to think about it, it may not be as radical as it seems at first blush. So let's say that you and this only works, by the way, if you have a payment plan that's not a private education loan. This won't work for private education loans. But let's say you've got something that's, it's not a private ed loan. It's no interest, less than a year, okay? And it's $300, $400, something like that. If you look and you determine that after graduation, that is almost always bad debt. No one is ever making payments on this. It might be worth considering whether it would just be in your best interest to write it off before the student completes the program. Because if you write it off so that it's no longer sitting on the ledger before they complete the program, right, then it's not going to go into your DE calculation because it's not an outstanding debt at the time of program completion. Couple of notes here. The first is, while this works for DE calculations, you might have to think through your accounting treatment of the student's debt, right? That might differ. I mean, really, the DE regulations just focus on whether or not the outstanding debt is still sitting on the ledger at the time of program completion. But I can understand that there might be some accounting considerations, and I'm sure that there are those out there, whoever's doing your annual Title IV audits and others that could talk to you a little bit about that, how that would affect your books. The other thing that I just want to mention is the department's definition of completion, right, is when the student has satisfied all requirements and completed the program. It is not the same as graduation. It is not when you hand them the credential and they walk across the stage. So if you're going to employ this strategy, just make sure that you do the write-off before they complete the program. If they complete the program and you do it just before they walk across the stage, you might run into an issue here. And I don't know how closely the department would be looking at that and that kind of thing, but why leave anything to chance? Just remember, under the law, it's before they complete the requirements for the program that you would need to make this decision and write the money off. Okay, we talked about it. So analyze whether high percentages of outstanding debt already are being written off as bad debt. Okay, and again, just make sure program completion. So we covered that slide. Okay, borrowing behavior strategies. I don't mean borrowing behavior strategies from other people. I really meant like borrower behavior strategies. So the idea here is to try to, all the stuff we were talking about previously, for the most part, are operational strategies. And what I mean by that is these are things that you all can do as an institution unilaterally, right? You look at your books and you just decide we're going to change the price, or we're going to write off debt, or we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And in many cases, those solutions have more direct and immediate consequences and more certain consequences. I mean, if you reduce the price of the program from $10,000 to $8,000, you know mathematically what the consequence is going to be. These strategies, admittedly, are more difficult. The idea here is that you are actually trying to impact and affect the borrowing behavior of your students so that it will benefit the DE rate calculation on the back end. And obviously, anytime you're trying to change the way that a group of people are acting, that's a heavy lift. And I completely acknowledge that. Nonetheless, if you've got a program or two that you think are in trouble and they are important programs for your bottom line, or for whatever reason, then this may be the type of strategy, in addition to some of the others, that you want to employ. So, require intensive quality financial literacy training at the beginning of each term. I know there are lots of folks in FA departments that are on the line right now, and I know that everyone in FA works hard, and that at most schools they have very good financial FA sort of orientation and counseling sessions already. I get that. But we are really talking here about taking it to another level, right? And we're talking about sitting down with folks and getting very serious with them in a way that you hope will impact their borrowing behavior. Again, I get that's a heavy lift, but this is something you may need to consider. And as good as your current orientation, and initial FA training may be, there probably is room almost always to step it up a little bit and intensify it a little bit. So the question here is, are you in a place with regard to gainful employment in your DE rates that it merits stepping it up and going to that next level of intensity? Require incoming students to complete a budget before they can borrow and to sign a pledge to repay loans. So these are pretty serious, obviously pretty serious things that could, and it could turn some students off, and I appreciate that as well. Modify award letters to highlight debt, right? So you're not taking away the award, but you're highlighting the debt and the debt obligation. This one is even more in the weeds and would require even more work. Establish a minimal cost of attendance. So you establish a baseline cost of attendance that's pretty low, And then you require students to document actionable costs as part of an appeal process for an upward adjustment. I know there are FA people on the other end of this going, oh my gosh, that would be such a huge challenge, right? Depends on the size of your school, how many people are in the program, right? I mean, maybe for some of your GU programs this doesn't work, but if you have one where you've only got 10 or 12 or 13 students on a regular basis, but they have a high debt load, maybe just for that program you implement this, right? Another consideration is to target students of concern for aggressive debt counseling and this is important, case-by-case evaluation. So you all know you can't have a blanket policy to just say we're not going to disperse aid beyond certain limits or, you know, we're going to restrict aid categorically. You can't do that. It's against the law. But you can review borrowing on a case-by-case basis, right? I mean, you guys know that is permitted. You have to document why. But if you review on a case-by-case basis and there are certain instances and you can document it, you can refuse to certify loans or limit the amount that a student gets, right? So maybe you have some way, I mean, most of us know, and I was just having this conversation in another institution yesterday. Somebody was asking about repayment rates and court default rates, and they said, you know, how can we be held accountable? Because there are always that 1 or 2% of students, maybe more, but that 1 or 2% that are really abusive, right? I mean, these are folks who are going school to school. They're always maxing out loans, and they may have even said to you things that pretty strongly suggest that they really don't intend to finish the program or they really don't intend to pay back their loans. You could treat those people on a case-by-case basis, right? And if you can document that someone does not intend to finish the program or does not intend to pay the loans back, that might justify, in this case, a limitation in how much they can take out. This is, again, a dramatic strategy, and I appreciate that, but if you've got a program that's on the ropes and you're trying to come up with, again, a combination of strategies that may help, this is the kind of thing, if you can knock out 2 or 3 or 4 students from your cohort that are bad borrowers, I'll call them, then you might be able to improve the overall numbers significantly. Earning strategies. So we've been talking about strategies. We talked about program portfolio mix. We talked about debt and cost. These last few are focused on the denominator in the equation. So improve earnings through enhanced enrollment management. Now, this is another one that's tough and it's indirect, right? But one thing you can try to do is to try to pick students on the front end that are more likely to be successful, not just graduating your program, but actually getting good jobs, right? So adjust lead generation criteria to target students most likely to be successful. That may take some research on your part to figure out who that is. Mandate criteria and contracts with lead providers. Something else you do, consider requiring or increasing minimum high school GPA or admissions test scores, all focused on improving the quality of the folks who are starting your program. Require a more extensive application for admission or an essay, so this is like a test of commitment, right? Or add or increase application fees. Again, you're talking about filtering out less committed students. You know, and I know you say, well, gosh, enrollments are down. The last thing I want to do is something that's going to further decrease enrollments. But if, you know, this is just a consideration each school has to make on its own. But if the options are lower enrollments or no enrollments because my program's ineligible, it may make sense to implement something like this on the front end. Establish try before you buy policies and orientation programs. Some schools out there have done this kind of thing, which increases the likelihood that an uninsured student will withdraw before they borrow and not after. Improve earnings through career services. I know lots of the schools on this line already have robust career services offerings. So, you know, encourage jobs and employers that don't encourage cash tips or other unreported income. And I know for the cosmetology folks and the massage therapy folks and folks in certain other professions where there's a lot of cash that gets paid and tip that gets paid and then doesn't get reported, this can be a real challenge. But you may know that there are some salons in town or employers that do a really good job with their W-2s and encourage better reporting behavior. You know, try to funnel people if you can towards those employers because it's going to benefit you. Offer training to graduate students regarding resume creation, interviewing, business etiquette. A lot of you guys do this already, but if you don't, something to consider. Encourage students to move where jobs are instead of staying in impoverished or local neighborhoods. So that's pretty self-explanatory, right? But if one reason people aren't going to have any earnings to report is because they don't have a job. So encourage them to go to where the jobs are. Enhance externship relationships to strengthen employment opportunities. So, you know, building your relationships as an institution, either directly with employers or with externship sites, can help improve the likelihood that folks will get employed in those places and make good money. Cover the cost of test preparation and exam fees for industry certifications. So if you know that folks with a certain certification are much more likely to get employed and make good money, maybe it would behoove you to consider covering the cost of that test prep and even the exam. Offer tuition rebate to graduates who pass certification exams. And the department has suggested even that in the preamble to the regs that this kind of thing, you know, they think would be okay. I mean, it's a positive incentive. They get less money, and now they have an incentive to pass a needed certification exam. What I mean by less money is they have less debt. Improve alternate earnings appeals through enhanced communication protocols. So what do I mean by that? So some of you may be relying on the ability to file an alternative earnings appeal with the department and in that way challenge the data they get from Social Security Administration. I will tell you, we'll talk about this more in depth next week. It is a complicated process, and I have my doubts, at least early on, about how easy it's going to be to get an effective appeal through the department. But one thing you can do now is to make adjustments that will position you better down the road to get the data you need. So review and update systems for maintaining contact with graduates. If you don't have a good system for that, you're going to need it because in order to get survey information from graduates, you're going to have to be able to find them, right? So improve whatever you're doing now to get contact information from graduates and stay where they are and keep updated emails and that kind of thing, right? Work directly with employers to facilitate tracking and communication with graduates. You know, so again, you're going to want to be able to reach out to graduates after the fact and working with employers to make sure that that's easier to do is a positive thing. Condition graduates to complete earnings surveys. So try to talk to them a little bit about why it's important. I mean, obviously to report accurately and legally to the IRS what they've earned, but also to get back to you and let you know what their earnings are, right? Because it's positive for the school. Folks who enjoyed their education and have good things to say about your school should connect with this and understand that they are helping you by making sure that they stay in touch with you. And on the final slide here, I've got 2 or 3 what I'll call really radical strategies. And I'm not even necessarily advocating these, but I just want to at least cover them, right? Because it may be that this is what certain schools are looking at the end of the day. One concept is to encourage limited Title IV borrowing from cash-paying students. So you may recall I said last week, right? The only folks who get included in the DE rate calculations are folks who got some form of Title IV. So if you've got a student, say you offer a $10,000 program, and you've got a student who's willing to pay all $10,000 in cash, that person's not going to be included in the calculation. On the other hand, if they took out $2,000 in Title IV loans, they would be, right? And it may be that that $2,000 is a lot better than the $12,000 or $13,000 in loans that most of your students are taking out. So the point is, by encouraging a limited amount of borrowing from cash pay folks, and this is tricky business, I get that. But the idea is to try to get them included in the rate calculation because ultimately their low level of borrowing is going to be good for your calculation. Now, again, it's really tricky business, right? You don't know how much they're going to borrow, and if they decide to borrow everything after all, they say, boy, these Title IV loans really are great. They could take out the 12 or 13, and then you haven't done yourself any favors. The other problem is this is bad for 90-10. If you're a for-profit school and you're subject to 90-10, now instead of having $10,000 of non-Title IV revenue in your good 10, you're only getting 8. Because that person has just, picked up a $2,000 loan in my hypothetical. So this is tricky business, and I acknowledge that. Transition out of Title IV. That's another option. I mean, it's something to consider. If you think the program is a good, solid program and you like it and it's got a lot of merit and the GE stuff just doesn't get that, maybe you have great graduation rates, great employment rates, but the metrics don't just work. But you want to keep teaching the program. Consider whether you can move it out of Title IV. Maybe you're in a state that's got state grant funding. Maybe there are some other options that might be available. But keep in mind that the transition has to be controlled. The department has made quite clear, and this isn't really in the law, but this is just their current policy, and they talked about this not too long ago in some guidance they put out. They said, it's not okay to just stop making Title IV available to for a program, right? So that you've got maybe some students who started the program a while back who are still getting Title IV, but now you're not going to let new students get Title IV. They don't like the idea of inequity. Everybody in the program should have the same ability to access Title IV all the time. right? Now, ironically, if your program becomes ineligible, this is exactly what happens, right? You just all of a sudden are no longer able to get these folks Title IV. But the department, for, left hand, right hand aren't talking here, but when they're thinking about this, it's their view that you shouldn't do it that way. Their view is you should have to teach out the program to its end so that everybody has full access to Title IV until it's completely taught out, and then relaunch it, right, with no Title IV. Whether you feel like you need to do that, again, that's not in the law. That's their policy. Whether you feel like you're in need of a drastic situation and you want to pursue whether there are other ways to go about transitioning out of Title IV, I mean, those are all things for you to think about. You can call us about that or some other attorney that does this kind of work. But the idea, anyway, is still there, potentially transitioning the program out of Title IV. By the way, I'm not suggesting the whole school, just that program. Finally, convert the institution to nonprofit. I mean, look, this has happened a little bit out there. The department is wary of it. There are folks on the Hill who hate the idea because they feel like there have been schools that may have converted to nonprofit specifically to get their non-degree programs out from under gainful employment, because their degree programs out from under gainful employment. Because remember, even if you're nonprofit, your non-degree programs will still be covered. Let me say that again in case I went through that pretty quickly, and occurs to me not everybody may be aware of that. So, for-profit schools, almost all programs covered, right? A couple of limited exceptions, but for the most part, all programs covered. Nonprofit schools, degree programs are not subject to gainful employment, only non-degree programs. So, if you're a school with a for-profit school with a large degree portfolio, very few non-degree programs, right, and you convert it to nonprofit, those degree programs are no longer subject to gainful employment, right? At least that is how the law works. Now, I will tell you it's the same with 90-10, and the department's taken the position that when a school converts, they're still subject to 90-10 for a year. I mean, I don't know where that is in the law, but that's their policy position right now. I could see them trying to come up with a similar policy position saying, well, we want to hold recently converted schools to gainful employment for a year. That's down the road, I guess. But the salient point here is if you did convert to a nonprofit, it's challenging, it's not cheap, it's not favored right now with the department, but theoretically you could do it. And if you successfully did it, then your degree programs would no longer be subject, for now, under current law, would no longer be subject to gainful employment and the DE rate analysis. So, again, it's a drastic option, but it's one that at least in theory is out there. All right, let's talk about GE resources. By the way, this is not an exhaustive list. I mean, you may see elsewhere there are other options. I just couldn't cover everything in an hour, but that's a lot of what's out there on the table. Resources, these are all active links. Again, they'll be included in what we send out. This is the Department of Education's Gainful Employment Information page and sort of the breakdown of the things that are there. And if you click those links, it'll take you right to those individual resources. Obviously, we talked about this series. That's something that we're providing in the desk guide. In addition, we have our higher education law and policy blog, Regulation, and we talk about gainful employment and other issues, FERPA, HIPAA, all that kind of great stuff on a regular basis, and you are very welcome to check it out. That's why it's there. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks for staying on. I know we're a pretty fair amount after the 1 o'clock mark, but, always enjoy answering questions. Hope that's useful, and look forward to seeing everybody next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.